The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on February 14th, 2024. But love was the furthest thing from anyone's mind that night. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I've been documenting crash scenes for the Wyoming State Highway Patrol for 8 years now. I've seen semis folded like accordions, motorcycles scattered across 3 lanes of asphalt, and cars so mangled you need dental records to identify the drivers. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found on Interstate 80 that Valentine's night. The blizzard had been building since noon, dumping snow at a rate that made the plows useless. Wind gusts were hitting 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that turned the highway into a death trap. Dispatch had been fielding calls all evening about vehicles sliding off the road, but this one was different. The initial report came from a trucker whose CB crackled with static. Jesus Christ, there's gotta be 50 cars piled up out here. It just keeps going and going. I loaded my equipment into the patrol SUV and headed west on 80, following the red and blue lights that strobed through the snow like dying stars. The closer I got, the more units I saw. Fire and rescue, ambulances, even the National Guard had been called in. Whatever waited ahead wasn't just another weather-related accident. Sergeant Rico Martinez met me at the perimeter they'd established about a quarter mile from the scene. His face was pale in the headlight glare, and his breath came in sharp puffs that the wind immediately tore away. "Elena, I need you to document everything exactly as you see it," he said, his voice tight. "Don't move anything. Don't touch anything. Just shoot it and get out." The walk to the crash site took 20 minutes through knee-deep snow. The wind was so fierce I had to lean into it to stay upright, and the cold bit through my winter gear like it was tissue paper. But as we crested a small hill, the full scope of the disaster revealed itself. 47 vehicles. I counted them twice to be sure. They were strung out along nearly a mile of highway. A chain reaction collision that defied every principle of accident reconstruction I'd learned. Cars, trucks, SUVs, even a school bus, all accordioned together in a pattern that made no sense. The first thing that struck me wasn't the scale, it was the positioning. Every single vehicle was angled forward, as if the drivers had been accelerating when they hit the car in front of them. Not braking, not trying to avoid collision, but speeding up. Some of the rear-end impacts were so severe that the trailing cars had actually climbed over the ones in front, creating grotesque pyramids of twisted metal and shattered glass. I started at the back of the chain and worked forward, my camera capturing every impossible detail. The final car, a red Honda Civic, had its accelerator pedal punched completely through the firewall. The driver, a young woman in her 20s, was still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that the coroner would later need tools to pry her fingers loose. Her eyes were wide open, staring into the rearview mirror. The second car, a blue pickup truck, had rear-ended the Civic with such force that the bed had compressed into the cab. The driver was an older man, maybe 60, and his face was locked in an expression of absolute terror. But he wasn't looking forward at the impact. He was craned around, looking back through the rear window. Car after car, the pattern repeated. Drivers who had been looking behind them when they crashed. Passengers twisted in their seats, staring out the back windows. Even children in car seats had their heads turned around, as if watching something approach from behind. By the time I reached the 20th vehicle, my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. A white sedan contained a family of 4, mother, father, 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They'd been eating McDonald's when they crashed. Happy Meal toys were scattered across the dashboard, and French fries had spilled everywhere. But all 4 faces were turned toward the rear window, and the father's foot was still jammed against the accelerator. The really disturbing part was the timing. According to the preliminary reports, the crashes had happened over the course of nearly 40 minutes. This wasn't a single moment of whiteout visibility causing a pileup. These people had been crashing, one after another, for the better part of an hour, and every single one of them had been looking behind them when they hit. I was documenting the 30-second vehicle when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Through the snow and the strobing emergency lights, I could see something wrong with my own footprints. I'd been walking from car to car for over an hour, but when I looked back along my path, there were two sets of tracks in the snow, mine and something else. The second set was deeper, wider, and they followed my exact route, but they weren't there when I'd started. I was sure of it. I radioed Martinez. "Sarge, I need backup out here. There's someone else on the scene." His response came through in broken static. "Negative, Elena. You're the only one cleared for the scene. Everyone else is at the perimeter." I looked back again. The tracks were still there, filling up slowly with fresh snow, but definitely real. Something had been following me from car to car, staying maybe 20 feet behind, watching me work. That's when I heard it, a sound like fingernails scraping against metal carried on the wind. It was coming from somewhere behind me, back along the line of wrecked cars. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the swirling snow. The scraping came again, closer this time, and with it, a new sound breathing. Deep, ragged inhalations that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. I started walking faster, moving from vehicle to vehicle, trying to finish my documentation, but the sounds were keeping pace with me, always just at the edge of my perception. Scraping metal, labored breathing, and now something else, footsteps that didn't match the pattern of my own. When I reached the front of the chain, the lead vehicle, I understood why everyone had been running. It was a semi-truck, jackknifed across both lanes, and painted on its trailer in letters 3 feet tall were the words, "Highway Cleanup Crew, stay back 200 feet. But the truck was pristine. No snow on the windshield, engine still running, exhaust pipe breathing white smoke into the frozen air. The driver's door was open, and there were no tracks leading away from the cab. It was as if whoever had been driving had simply vanished. I approached the driver's side and looked into the cab. The seat was still warm. The radio was tuned to a station that was playing nothing but static. And clipped to the sun visor was a work order dated February 14th, 2024, today's date. The work order was for highway cleanup on Interstate 80, mile markers 215 through 240, debris removal and road maintenance. But at the bottom, in handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had added, "Collection complete, 47 units acquired." The scraping sound was right behind me now, so close I could feel warm breath on my neck despite the sub-zero temperature. I spun around, camera raised, flash firing automatically. For just an instant, caught in the white-hot burst of light, I saw them. The drivers, all 47 of them, standing in the snow between their wrecked vehicles. They were watching me with empty eye sockets, their faces locked in expressions of terror, their bodies turned away from me as if they were still trying to run from something behind them. The flash faded, and they were gone. Just empty cars and swirling snow, and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I ran through knee-deep snow, following my own tracks back to the perimeter, my equipment banging against my back with every step. Martinez found me collapsed against a patrol car, hypothermic, and babbling about work orders and cleanup crews. The official report listed it as a weather-related pileup caused by whiteout conditions. 47 fatalities, no survivors. The semi-truck at the front of the chain was never found, despite the fact that I had dozens of photographs of it. When the film was developed, every image of that truck came back blank, just white rectangles where the cab should have been. But sometimes, when I drive Interstate 80 late at night, I see a semi in my rearview mirror. It stays exactly 200 feet back, just like the sign said, and its headlights never get any closer, no matter how fast I drive. The work order is still clipped to my sun visor, and the handwriting at the bottom has changed. Now it says, "Collection incomplete, 1 unit outstanding." I don't drive that stretch of highway anymore, but I dream about it. In my dreams, I'm always running through the snow, camera in hand, documenting something that should never have been documented. And behind me, getting closer every night, I can hear the scraping of metal and the sound of 47 people trying to escape something they never could. The cleanup never ended. It just found new work. The explosion happened at 3:27 a.m. on September 8, 2024, but the workers had been running for at least 10 minutes before the grain silo blew. I'm Vincent Torres, and I've been documenting industrial accidents for OSHA for 15 years. I've photographed collapsed scaffolding, chemical spills, machinery accidents that turned human beings into statistics. My job is to capture the evidence that prevents the next disaster, to find the story that concrete and steel and twisted metal tell about the moment everything went wrong. But what I found at the Midwest Agricultural Processing Plant in Nebraska wasn't a story about equipment failure or safety violations. It was something else entirely. The call came in while I was finishing paperwork at the regional office in Omaha. A grain silo explosion at a processing plant outside the small town of Waverly. 12 dead, no survivors. The initial report suggested a dust ignition event, common enough in agricultural facilities, where grain particles can create explosive atmospheres. I loaded my equipment and drove the 40-minute route to the plant, expecting another routine documentation of industrial negligence. Midwest Agricultural Processing sat on 200 acres of Nebraska farmland, a complex of steel buildings and concrete silos that processed corn and wheat for distribution across the Midwest. The facility operated 3 shifts, and the night crew had been working a routine maintenance cycle when silo number 4 exploded with enough force to shatter windows in buildings a quarter-mile away. The scene was controlled chaos when I arrived. Fire department, paramedics, county sheriff, state investigators all coordinating around a crater where silo number 4 used to stand. The blast had been so powerful that debris was scattered across 5 acres, chunks of concrete and twisted steel embedded in the walls of adjacent buildings. Plant supervisor Dennis Kowalski met me at the gate. He was a thin man in his 50s, with gray stubble and eyes that couldn't focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. "We've never had anything like this," he kept saying. 30 years I've worked here, never lost a single person. Not one." The first thing that struck me as unusual was the positioning of the bodies. In most industrial explosions, victims are found at their workstations or along evacuation routes. But the 12 workers weren't found where they should have been according to the work schedule. They were clustered in 3 distinct groups at locations that made no operational sense. 4 workers were found in the parking lot, huddled behind a pickup truck that was parked over 100 yards from the silo. 3 more were discovered in a maintenance shed that wasn't even connected to the grain processing operation. The remaining 5 had taken shelter in the break room of Building C, which was on the opposite side of the complex from their assigned work areas. All of them had been running when the explosion caught them. The blast pattern analysis confirmed it. They were moving away from silo number 4 at the moment of detonation, not toward it or perpendicular to it, but directly away from it. And according to the timestamps on the security system, they had started running at least 10 minutes before the explosion occurred. I began documenting the scene systematically, starting with the crater where the silo had stood. The foundation was intact, which ruled out a ground-level gas leak. The blast pattern suggested the explosion had originated about 15 feet up the silo wall, typical for a dust ignition event. But there was something wrong with the debris field. Mixed in with the concrete and steel were fragments that didn't belong, pieces of wood, weathered and old, some with what looked like hand-carved markings. Shards of glass that appeared to be from old-fashioned lanterns, not the modern LED lighting the facility used. And scattered throughout the wreckage were small metal objects that I initially mistook for industrial hardware, but turned out to be hand-forged nails, the kind used in 19th century construction. The security footage only deepened the mystery. The cameras showed the night shift workers going about their normal routines, until 3:17 a.m., when something changed. It wasn't visible on the footage, no flash of light, no obvious explosion or accident. But at exactly 3:17, every worker on the night shift stopped what they were doing and looked toward the same corner of the facility, an area that contained nothing but an empty loading dock. Then they started running, not panicking, not shouting or stumbling, but running with purpose toward specific locations. The three groups that would eventually be found dead had formed immediately, as if they knew exactly where they needed to go and who they needed to go with. For 10 minutes, the cameras recorded 12 people taking shelter in locations that offered no protection from a grain silo explosion. And then, at 3:27, silo number 4 simply exploded, with no visible ignition source and no mechanical failure that should have triggered such a massive blast. I interviewed the few plant employees who had been off-duty that night. They all told the same story: the facility had been experiencing problems for the past 3 weeks. Equipment running by itself during shutdown periods, workers reporting voices coming from empty areas of the plant, security guards finding doors standing open that they were certain they had locked. "There's something wrong with that corner of the plant," said maintenance worker Carl Brennan, pointing toward the empty loading dock, where the security cameras had captured the workers looking just before they started running. Building C used to be there, back in the 1930s. Old grain elevator, burned down in 38, killed 16 people. I requested the historical records for the property. What I found made my hands shake as I read through the documents. The original Waverly grain elevator had indeed burned down on September 8, 1938, exactly 86 years before the explosion I was investigating. 16 workers had died in that fire, trapped when the wooden structure collapsed around them. But the really disturbing detail was in the witness statements from 1938. According to survivors, the workers who died had been running toward the main exit when the building collapsed. They had formed 3 groups, trying to help each other escape the flames. But the fire had spread too quickly, and they were caught just yards from safety. The parallels were impossible to ignore. 3 groups of workers, running from danger they somehow knew was coming. Deaths occurring at the same location, exactly 86 years apart, on the same date. And now, mixed in with the debris from a modern concrete silo, I was finding pieces of the old wooden elevator that had supposedly been cleared away decades ago. That evening, I returned to the site alone to photograph some details I had missed. The plant was shut down pending investigation, and the security guards had been told to let me work undisturbed. I set up my equipment in the crater where silo number 4 had stood and began taking detailed shots of the foundation. As darkness fell, I noticed something that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about industrial accidents. The debris wasn't settling the way it should. Pieces of concrete that I had photographed and cataloged were moving, shifting position between shots. Not dramatically, just small movements, as if they were being gently rearranged by invisible hands. I checked my camera settings, thinking it might be a technical issue, but the movement was real. Chunks of debris were slowly forming patterns, creating pathways that led away from the center of the crater toward 3 specific points: the parking lot, the maintenance shed, and Building C. The same 3 locations where the workers had been found. As I watched, more debris began to move. The hand-forged nails were rolling across the ground, following the pathways carved by the larger pieces. The glass fragments from the old lanterns were being pushed into neat piles, as if someone was trying to reconstruct something that had been broken. And then I heard them. Voices, faint but unmistakable, calling out warnings in the darkness. "Get to the truck! This way! This way! The shed! We can make it to the shed! Building C! Run for Building C!" The voices were coming from the crater, from the exact spot where silo number 4 had stood. But they weren't the voices of the workers who had died 3 days ago. These voices were older, more distant, calling out in the cadence and vocabulary of men from another era. I raised my camera and began shooting, using the flash to illuminate the scene. In the split-second bursts of light, I saw them shadows running between the debris piles, following the pathways that led toward shelter that no longer existed or had never been adequate. 16 figures from 1938, still running from a fire that had burned out 86 years ago. And running alongside them, newer shadows, 12 workers who had somehow heard those old voices calling and had followed them towards safety that could never come. The flash faded and the shadows disappeared, but the debris continued to move, continued to form those pathways, as if the very ground was trying to tell me something about what had really happened here. I packed up my equipment and left. The official report listed the explosion as a dust ignition event caused by equipment malfunction. The historical connections were noted but dismissed as coincidence. The debris anomalies were attributed to settling and wind patterns. But I kept the photographs. Dozens of images showing debris that moved between shots, shadows that shouldn't exist, and pathways that led nowhere. And sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing accident scenes for other cases, I find myself studying those pictures and wondering about the stories that industrial sites tell when no one is listening. The Midwest Agricultural Processing Plant was demolished 6 months later. The insurance company said it was more cost-effective than repairs. But before the bulldozers moved in, I drove out there one last time. The debris had formed a perfect pattern. 3 clear pathways leading from the crater to the 3 points where both sets of workers had tried to find shelter. And carved into the concrete of the foundation, where no markings had been before, were 16 names from 1938 and 12 names from 2024. 28 workers who had heard the same voices, followed the same paths, and learned too late that some disasters echo across time, calling the living to join the dead in their eternal attempt to escape. The blood spatter on the wall spelled out, "Help us," in letters 3 inches tall, but it would be hours before I noticed the victims had been dead for over a week. I'm Sarah Kellerman, and I've been photographing crime scenes for the Camden County Prosecutor's Office for 9 years. I've documented everything from convenience store robberies to gang executions, but nothing prepared me for Apartment 4B at the Riverside Manor Complex on Federal Street. What looked like a straightforward murder-suicide turned into something that still keeps me checking my locks at night. The call came in on a Thursday morning in October of 2023. Anonymous tip about a smell coming from one of the units. Patrol officers found the door unlocked. 2 bodies in the living room, an elderly man and woman, both appearing to be in their 70s. The man was found with a .38 revolver in his hand, single gunshot wound to the temple. The woman had been shot twice in the chest. Detective Robert Marsh was lead on the case, a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough domestic violence to write a textbook. "Looks clean," he said as I unpacked my equipment. "Murder-suicide, probably a domestic dispute. Financial problems, health issues," one of them snapped. "Get your shots, and we'll wrap this up." But even before I started photographing, something felt wrong about the scene. The apartment was too clean, too organized for a crime of passion. The furniture was arranged with military precision. No signs of struggle, no overturned chairs or scattered belongings. Even the blood pooling around the bodies seemed too contained, too neat. I began my standard documentation pattern, working clockwise around the room. That's when I noticed the first anomaly: the victims weren't wearing the clothes they'd died in. Both bodies showed obvious post-mortem lividity patterns that didn't match their current positioning. Someone had moved them, dressed them, arranged them after death. The IDs in their wallets identified them as Harold and Margaret Steinberg, ages 72 and 69 respectively. But when I photographed their social security cards, the numbers didn't match the dates of birth on their driver's licenses. Small discrepancy, easily overlooked, but it nagged at me. As I worked deeper into the apartment, the inconsistencies multiplied. The medicine cabinet contained prescription bottles for 6 different names, all with the same address, but spanning a 10-year period. The refrigerator was covered with appointment cards for doctors in 4 different states. And in the bedroom closet, I found clothes that ranged from size small to extra large, both men's and women's, as if the apartment's occupants had been constantly changing their physical appearance. Detective Marsh was getting impatient. "Sarah, how long you need? This is open and shut." But I kept finding things that didn't add up. A shoebox under the bed contained birth certificates for 12 different people, all with the same 2 faces in different driver's license photos, spanning from 1985 to 2023. Harold and Margaret Steinberg, but also Robert and Linda Hayes, David and Carol Morrison, William and Patricia Newman, 11 other identities, each with complete documentation. The really disturbing discovery came when I started photographing the walls more carefully. What I had initially taken for random blood spatter was actually deliberate. Someone had used blood to write messages across multiple surfaces, not just "help us," but dozens of other phrases. They made us do it, not our choice. 40 years can't stop now. I called Detective Marsh over to examine the writing. He stared at the bloody messages for a long moment, then shook his head. "That's not from the shooting. Too much blood. Wrong consistency. This was written with a brush or cloth, not spatter from gunshots." We found the source in the kitchen, a coffee mug filled with blood that had been used as an inkwell. Next to it was a detailed journal written in 2 different handwritings, documenting what appeared to be a decades-long criminal enterprise spanning multiple states. The journal entries went back to 1983 and described a pattern of identity theft, insurance fraud, and murder that defied belief. Harold and Margaret, or whatever their real names were, had been assuming the identities of elderly couples, killing them, and then living their lives for months or years before moving on to new victims. Each entry was meticulously documented with photos, addresses, and detailed notes about their victims' habits and families. They had perfected a system of finding isolated elderly couples, studying them for weeks, then replacing them so smoothly that even close relatives didn't notice the substitution immediately. But the most chilling aspect of the journal was how it changed over time. The early entries were coldly professional, describing murders and identity thefts in clinical detail. But by the mid-1990s, the tone became increasingly desperate. References to being compelled to continue, to not being able to stop, to something that watches and waits. The final entries, dated just days before their deaths, were barely legible scrawls. "It's time for us to become someone else. But this time is different. This time we become the victims. We can feel it coming. 40 years we've been running from it, but you can't run forever. It's here now. It's in the walls." I was photographing the last journal entry when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The timestamp on my camera showed I'd been in the apartment for 4 hours, but Detective Marsh and the other officers had left 30 minutes ago. I was alone with 2 decomposing bodies in an apartment that seemed to be growing colder by the minute. That's when I heard the voices. Soft at first, like whispers from another room. But as I listened, I could make out distinct conversations, people introducing themselves, exchanging pleasantries, the kind of small talk you'd hear at a neighborhood gathering. The voices were coming from inside the walls, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. I pressed my ear against the living room wall and heard them clearly, Harold and Margaret's voices, but also the voices of Robert and Linda Hayes, David and Carol Morrison, all the identities they had assumed over the years. And underneath those, fainter but unmistakable, were the voices of their victims, the real Harold and Margaret Steinberg, the real Robert and Linda Hayes, all of them talking at once, introducing themselves to each other in an endless loop of polite conversation. The temperature in the apartment dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the windows despite the October heat outside. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear them talking about me now. She's the photographer. She's documenting us. She sees the truth. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. The deadbolt was unlocked. The chain wasn't engaged, but the door felt like it was sealed shut. I pulled at it frantically while the voices behind me grew to a roar, dozens of people all talking at once, introducing themselves, explaining who they really were, begging to be remembered. The blood on the walls began to move, the words rearranging themselves into new messages. You know the truth now. Document everything. Tell their stories. The journal on the kitchen table flipped open by itself, pages turning to reveal entries I hadn't seen before, detailed descriptions of victims going back 60 years, far longer than Harold and Margaret could have been active. And then I understood. They hadn't been the killers. They had been victims themselves, taken sometime in the 1980s and forced to continue the work of whoever had taken them. The apartment wasn't just a crime scene, it was a repository for every identity that had been stolen, every life that had been erased, a place where the forgotten came to be remembered. The door finally opened, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The voices stopped immediately, but the cold followed me. I drove straight to the station and filed my report, including everything I'd found. But when Detective Marsh went back to collect additional evidence, Apartment 4B was empty, clean. No bodies, no blood, no journal, no identification documents. The landlord insisted the apartment had been vacant for 3 months. The utilities had been shut off, no rent payments on record. The Camden County Coroner's Office had no record of any bodies being collected from that address. My photographs told a different story. Hundreds of images documenting the crime scene, the evidence, the bloody messages on the walls. But when I tried to access them from the department database, the files were corrupted. Every single image appeared as a solid black rectangle, except for one. The last photo I'd taken showed the living room wall where "Help Us" had been written in blood. But in the photograph, the message was different. It read, "Thank you for remembering us, Sarah Kellerman. I don't work crime scenes anymore. I transferred to the prosecutor's office records department, filing paperwork and managing databases. It's safer there, surrounded by living people and fluorescent lights. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the office, I hear whispers from the filing cabinets, voices introducing themselves, telling me their real names, asking me to remember who they used to be before someone took their lives and wore their faces. I keep a list now, written in a journal I hide in my desk drawer, names and dates and whatever details I can remember from that apartment. Harold and Margaret Steinberg were real people once, and so were all the others. Someone should remember them, even if the official files say they never existed, because I learned something in Apartment 4B that no training ever taught me. Some crimes don't end when the perpetrators die. They echo forward, demanding witnesses, requiring documentation, insisting that the truth be preserved even when the evidence disappears. Especially when the evidence disappears. The distress calls were coming from Level 7, but Level 7 had been sealed with concrete and steel 30 years before any of the dead miners were even born. I'm David Liu, and I've been documenting mine safety incidents for the Montana Department of Labor for 11 years. I've photographed collapsed shafts, equipment failures, and gas explosions that turned underground workplaces into tombs. But what I found at the Anaconda Copper Mine in Butte challenged everything I understood about industrial accidents and the nature of death itself. The cave-in occurred on November 15, 2023, during the night shift at the mine's active Level 3 operations. 8 miners were killed when a support beam failed, bringing down approximately 200 tons of rock and debris. It should have been a straightforward documentation job: photograph the scene, identify safety violations, file the report that would prevent similar tragedies. The Anaconda mine had been operating since 1864, one of the oldest continuously worked copper mines in Montana. Over the decades, it had expanded into a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that honeycombed the mountain. Levels 1 through 4 were still active, but levels 5 through 9 had been permanently sealed in 1993 after a series of methane gas incidents made them too dangerous to operate. Mine supervisor Jake Patterson met me at the surface entrance, a weathered man in his 60s whose hands shook slightly when he lit his cigarettes. "Worst accident we've had in 20 years, he said, leading me toward the cage elevator that would take us down to level 3. 8 good men, all with families. Makes no sense why that beam failed. It was inspected just last month." The descent into the mine always unsettled me. The cage dropped through absolute darkness. The only sounds, the grinding of cables and the distant echo of machinery from the active levels. At 300 feet below ground, the weight of the earth above felt like a physical presence, pressing down with the accumulated mass of geological time. Level 3 stretched out in multiple directions from the main shaft, a network of tunnels lit by harsh fluorescent lights that created stark shadows between the support beams. The cave-in had occurred in Tunnel C7, about a quarter mile from the elevator. As we walked toward the accident site, I noticed something that made me pause. Fresh graffiti on the tunnel walls, scratched into the rock with sharp tools. "Help us. Trapped on 7. Can't get out." The messages were carved deep into the stone, and the rock dust around them was still white and fresh, as if they'd been made recently, but the handwriting looked old-fashioned, formed with the careful precision of someone who had learned to write with a fountain pen decades ago. Patterson noticed me photographing the graffiti. "Vandalism," he said dismissively. "Kids break in sometimes. Think it's funny to scare people with ghost stories. We've had trouble with level 7. Since it was sealed, people claim they hear things, see lights where there shouldn't be any." The cave-in site was exactly what I expected, a wall of broken rock and twisted metal where Tunnel C7 had been. The 8 victims had been working on routine maintenance when the support beam snapped without warning. Emergency crews had spent 18 hours digging them out, but it was too late. All 8 were found together, huddled in a small pocket of space that should have provided protection, but somehow hadn't. I began my standard documentation, photographing the failed beam, the rock fall pattern, the emergency equipment that had been used in the rescue attempt. But as I worked, I became aware of something that didn't belong in an active mine. Voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, too distant to make out words, but clearly human. "Patterson, are there other crews working down here today?" He shook his head. "Level 3 is shut down until the investigation is complete. We're the only ones down here." But the voices continued, sometimes seeming to come from the walls themselves, and mixed in with them was another sound, the rhythmic tapping of metal on rock, like someone using a pickaxe or hammer. The sound had a desperate quality, the frantic pace of people trying to dig their way out of something. I followed the sound deeper into the tunnel system, my camera equipment bouncing against my back as I walked. The voices grew clearer as I moved away from the cave-in site, and I began to make out individual words. "Hello? Can anyone hear us? We're trapped down here. Please, somebody help us." The voices were coming from behind a steel door marked Level 7 Access Permanently Sealed. The door was secured with multiple heavy-duty locks and warning signs about methane gas and structural instability. But I could hear people on the other side, calling for help, their voices echoing up from the depths. Patterson caught up with me at the sealed door. His face had gone pale when he saw where I was standing. "You can't hear them too, can you?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" "The voices. From level 7. They started up again about a week ago. Same time every day. The miners were getting spooked, talking about going down to check it out. Management told them to ignore it, but..." He didn't need to finish. I understood. The 8 dead miners had been hearing voices calling for help from a section of the mine that had been sealed for 30 years. And they had died, trying to reach whoever was trapped down there. I pressed my ear against the steel door. The voices were clearer now, and what I heard made my blood freeze. They weren't just calling for help, they were calling specific names. The names of the 8 miners who had died in the cave-in. Johnson, can you hear us? We're stuck down here in 7? Martinez, bring the cutting torch. Williams, we need help with the gas leak. These were the voices of men who had been dead for decades, calling to men who had just died, trying to save them. Patterson was backing away from the door, his breathing rapid and shallow. It's impossible, he whispered. Level 7 has been sealed since '93. No one could be alive down there. No one could have survived 30 years without food, without fresh air. But I kept listening, and the picture became clearer. The voices weren't just random calls for help, they were describing a specific emergency. A methane gas leak, a tunnel collapse, men trapped in a pocket of level 7 with no way out. The same emergency that had led to the level being permanently sealed 30 years ago. I pulled out my phone and called the mine's administrative office, requesting the safety records from 1993. The clerk was reluctant to dig through archived files, but I pressed her, claiming it was part of the official investigation into the recent deaths. 20 minutes later, she called back with information that turned my professional skepticism into something close to terror. On November 15, 1993, exactly 30 years before the cave-in that killed 8 miners, there had been a methane explosion on level 7. 8 miners had been trapped in a section of tunnel that became inaccessible after the blast. Their bodies were never recovered before the level was permanently sealed. The names she read from the report were the same names the voices behind the steel door were calling: Johnson, Martinez, Williams, and 5 others. 8 miners who had died 30 years ago were calling for help from 8 miners who had just died trying to reach them. As this realization sank in, the voices behind the door changed. They stopped calling for the dead miners and started talking to me directly. David Liu, they said, and my name echoed through the steel barrier with impossible clarity. Mine Safety Inspector. You can hear us, can't you? You know the truth now. The temperature in the tunnel dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the metal door despite the fact that we were 300 feet underground, in a mine that maintained a constant 50-degree temperature year-round. They tried to help us. The voices continued. Johnson and his crew, they heard us calling and came down to dig us out. But you can't rescue the dead, David. You can only join them. The steel door began to vibrate, as if something heavy was striking it from the other side. The locks rattled, and I could hear the sound of metal grinding against metal, as if the door was slowly being forced open from within. Patterson grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the door. We need to get out of here. Now. But as we ran back toward the main shaft, the lights in the tunnel began to fail one by one, darkness following us like a living thing. Behind us, the steel door burst open with a sound like thunder, and I could hear footsteps in the darkness. 16 men walking together, 8 from 1993 and 8 from 2023. Their work finally done. We made it to the surface elevator and didn't stop running until we reached Patterson's office. He immediately ordered level 3 sealed, pending further investigation, but we both knew the real reason. Some accidents don't end when the victims die, they echo backward and forward through time, creating loops of tragedy that catch anyone who gets too close. My official report listed the cave-in as a structural failure caused by metal fatigue in the support beam. The voices from level 7 were noted as auditory phenomena, possibly related to air circulation through abandoned mine shafts. The fact that 8 miners had died trying to rescue 8 other miners who had been dead for 30 years was relegated to a footnote that was later classified and buried. But I kept the audio recordings I made that day. Sometimes, late at night, I play them back and listen to dead men calling for help from each other across 3 decades of darkness. And sometimes, just before I turn off the recording, I can hear my own name being called from somewhere deep underground inviting me to join the endless rescue operation that can never succeed. The Anaconda mine was permanently closed 6 months later, all levels sealed with concrete and steel. But on November 15th every year, locals report hearing sounds from inside the mountain, voices calling for help, the rhythm of pickaxes against stone, and the steady footsteps of men walking through darkness toward a rescue that will never come. I don't investigate mine accidents anymore. I work from a desk now, filing safety reports and reviewing photographs that other people take. But sometimes, when the building is quiet and I'm alone with my files, I can hear them 16 voices calling my name, telling me about the work that's still waiting to be done 300 feet underground in a mine that officially doesn't exist anymore. Because I learned something in Level 7 that no safety manual ever taught me. Some calls for help echo forever, and the only way to silence them is to answer. But once you answer, you become part of the call, part of the endless cycle of workers trying to save each other from disasters that happened decades ago and are still happening now. The mine keeps calling, and someday, I know I'm going to have to go back down and answer. The suicide notes were all written in the same handwriting, but they came from 15 different people who had never met before arriving at Riverside Care Facility. I'm Janet Hayes, and I've been documenting fire scenes for the Mississippi State Fire Marshal's Office for 13 years. I've photographed house fires, warehouse blazes, and arson cases that turned insurance fraud into murder. But nothing prepared me for what I found in the ashes of the Riverside Care Facility on a humid August morning in 2024. The call came in at 4:37 a.m. on August 22nd. A nursing home fire in Yazoo County. 15 fatalities. Suspicious circumstances. The facility housed 43 residents, mostly elderly people with various stages of dementia and physical disabilities. The fire had started in the East Wing around 3 a.m., spreading rapidly through the older section of the building before the sprinkler system could contain it. Riverside Care Facility sat on 30 acres of former cotton farmland, a single-story brick building that had been expanded multiple times since its original construction in 1978. The newest section, where most residents lived, had modern fire suppression systems and wide corridors designed for easy evacuation. But the East Wing, where the fire started, was part of the original structure, narrow hallways, older wiring, and rooms that had been converted from offices into patient quarters. Fire Chief Rebecca Morrison met me at the scene. She was a competent woman in her 40s who'd worked her way up through the ranks of rural fire departments, and her expression told me this wasn't a routine investigation. "Janet, we've got a problem," she said, leading me toward the burned section of the building. "The fire pattern doesn't make sense, and we've found some things that are going to require careful documentation." The East Wing was a skeleton of blackened beams and collapsed ceiling tiles. 15 residents had died in their rooms, apparently overcome by smoke before they could be evacuated. But what struck me immediately was how localized the fire damage was. The blaze had burned intensely in specific areas, while leaving adjacent rooms virtually untouched, as if it had followed a predetermined path through the building. I began my standard documentation, photographing the burn patterns, the points of origin, the condition of electrical systems and heating equipment. But as I worked deeper into the destroyed section, I noticed something that violated every principle of fire behavior I'd learned. The flames had burned in perfect rectangles, following the exact boundaries of certain rooms, while stopping abruptly at others. Room 127 was completely destroyed. Room 128, directly adjacent, showed no fire damage at all. Room 129 was gutted. Room 130 was untouched. The pattern continued down the entire hallway. Every other room burned to the foundation, while the rooms between them remained pristine. "Chief Morrison, have you seen burn patterns like this before?" She shook her head. "Never. It's like the fire knew exactly where it was supposed to go and where it wasn't. We've ruled out accelerants, no chemical residue, no pore patterns. But fire doesn't behave this way naturally. The really disturbing discovery came when we examined the personal effects that had survived the blaze. In each of the undamaged rooms, we found handwritten notes tucked under the residents' pillows. 15 identical suicide notes, all written in the same careful cursive handwriting, all dated 3 weeks before the fire occurred. I, resident name, being of sound mind, do hereby declare my intention to end my life on August 22, 2024, at approximately 3 a.m. I choose this death freely, and without coercion. The fire will come for me first, and I will welcome it. I am ready to join the others who have gone before. Please, do not mourn my passing. I go willingly to my rest. Each note was signed with a different name, but the handwriting was identical. More disturbing still, many of the residents who had supposedly written these notes were suffering from advanced dementia and hadn't been able to write coherently for years. I photographed each note carefully, documenting the paper, the ink, the precise formation of each letter. Whoever had written these had an old-fashioned penmanship style, the kind taught in schools decades ago. But the paper was modern, and the ink was from contemporary ballpoint pens. The facility's director, Patricia Crenshaw, met me in the administrative offices that had been undamaged by the fire. She was a nervous woman in her 60s who kept wringing her hands and glancing toward the burned wing as if she expected something to emerge from the ashes. Mrs. Crenshaw, I need to see the admission records for the 15 residents who died in the fire. She led me to a filing cabinet and pulled out the relevant folders. As I reviewed the documents, a pattern emerged that made my skin crawl. All 15 residents had been admitted to Riverside Care within the past 6 months. All 15 had been transferred from other facilities across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And all 15 had arrived with detailed medical histories that showed no previous connection to each other. But there was something else in their files' intake interviews that documented their mental state upon arrival. According to the notes, every single one of them had mentioned the others during their first week at the facility. They spoke about waiting for the others, joining the others, and the time when we'll all be together. The intake nurse who had conducted these interviews was Margaret Foster, a woman in her 70s who had worked at Riverside for over 20 years. I found her in the facility's break room, staring out the window at the burned wing, with an expression I couldn't read. Miss Foster, I need to ask you about the residents who died in the fire. You noted that they all mentioned the others during their intake interviews. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had seen something that couldn't be explained. They knew each other, she said quietly. Not from before they came here, I checked their backgrounds myself, but from the moment they arrived, they knew each other. They'd sit together in the common room, not talking, just waiting. And every night, around 3 a.m., I'd see them walking the halls together. Walking the halls? I thought most of them were bedridden or wheelchair-bound. That's what made it so strange. During the day, they needed assistance with everything, but at night, they'd all get up and walk. I'd find them standing in the East Wing, just standing there in the dark, waiting for something. I asked to see the security footage from the weeks leading up to the fire. The facility had cameras in the common areas, but not in the individual rooms. What I saw on those recordings defied medical logic and challenged my understanding of human behavior. Starting about 2 weeks after their admission, all 15 residents began displaying identical behavioral patterns. They would go to bed normally, but around 2:45 a.m., they would get up and walk to the East Wing. Residents who hadn't been able to stand without assistance during the day moved with purpose and coordination in the darkness. They would gather in the hallway outside their assigned rooms and stand silently until approximately 3:15 a.m., then return to their beds. This pattern continued every night until the fire. On the final recording, Dated August 22nd, I watched 15 elderly people walk calmly to their rooms in the East Wing at exactly 2:45 a.m. At 3 a.m., the cameras went dark. The fire department's investigation concluded that the blaze had started simultaneously in multiple locations, but they couldn't determine an ignition source. There was no electrical malfunction, no evidence of arson, no mechanical failure that could explain how fire had erupted in 7 different rooms at exactly the same moment. But I found something the fire investigators had missed. In the ruins of Room 127, partially hidden under debris, was a leather-bound journal that had somehow survived the intense heat. The pages were singed but readable, filled with the same careful handwriting I'd seen on the suicide notes. The journal entries went back 47 years and described a pattern of fires at nursing homes across the South. Different facilities, different decades, but always the same story. Elderly residents arriving from various locations, displaying identical behaviors, writing identical suicide notes, and dying in fires that followed impossible burn patterns. The entries were signed with different names, but the handwriting never changed. Margaret Thorne, 1977. Robert Campbell, 1983. Dorothy Martinez, 1991. 15 different signatures spanning decades, all in the same hand, all describing the same cycle of gathering and death. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before the Riverside fire. The 15 are here now. We have waited so long to be complete again. The fire will come for us at 3 a.m. on August 22nd. Just as it came for us before, we go willingly to our rest, knowing we will gather again when the time is right. The cycle continues. Death is not the end, it is merely the pause between gatherings. As I read those words, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. I could see my breath fogging in the air, despite the August heat outside. And then I heard them voices from the burned wing, 15 elderly people talking quietly among themselves, discussing plans for their next gathering. I ran from the building and didn't stop until I reached my car. When I looked back at the facility, I could see figures moving through the burned section, shadows that shouldn't exist in rooms that no longer had walls or ceilings. My official report attributed the fire to undetermined electrical causes and noted the unusual burn pattern as consistent with accelerated combustion due to building materials and airflow. The suicide notes were classified as possible dementia-related writings and sealed as part of the investigation. But I kept copies of everything, the photographs, the journal entries, the security footage, and I've been tracking similar incidents across the South ever since. Every few years, there's another nursing home fire with the same impossible characteristics. Residents who arrive from different facilities, gather in specific locations, write identical suicide notes, and die in fires that burn in perfect geometric patterns. The Riverside Care Facility was rebuilt on the same location. It houses 43 residents again, and according to the admission records I've been monitoring, 15 new patients have arrived in the past 6 months from facilities across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Their intake interviews all mention the others, and Margaret Foster, the longtime nurse who witnessed their nightly gatherings, submitted her resignation the day after the fire. She left a note explaining that she needed to join the others and couldn't wait any longer. They found her car abandoned on Highway 82, but they never found her. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing fire scene photographs, I can see her in the images I took of the burned wing. She's standing with the others, waiting for the next gathering, the next fire, the next cycle of planned deaths that aren't really deaths at all. Because some people don't die when their bodies burn. They just change locations and wait for the right time to come together again. And when they do, they plan ahead. The logbook entry for October 13, 2004, read, Tom Reeves, age 28, federal photographer, entered at 2:37 p.m., left at unknown time. But I had never been to Flint, Michigan before in my life. I'm Tom Reeves, and I've been documenting federal crime scenes for the Bureau for 16 years. I've photographed terrorist attacks, bank robberies, and organized crime scenes from Detroit to Dallas. My job is to capture evidence that will hold up in court, to create an objective record of what happened when everything went wrong. But what I found at the abandoned Martin Luther King Elementary School in Flint challenged my understanding of memory, time, and the reliability of my own experience. The shooting occurred on December 5, 2024, during a federal demolition training exercise. The building had been closed since 2009 when the Flint School District consolidated facilities, and it was scheduled for destruction as part of an urban renewal project. ATF agents were using the empty classrooms to practice controlled demolition techniques when shots were fired from somewhere inside the building. 2 agents were wounded, one in the shoulder, one in the leg, and the shooter escaped before backup could arrive. Initial reports suggested an intruder had been hiding in the building, but there were no signs of forced entry, and the perimeter had been secured before the training began. The shooting made no tactical sense, and that's when they called in the federal investigation team. Martin Luther King Elementary was a single-story brick building constructed in 1967, designed in the institutional style that characterized most public schools of that era. Long corridors lined with classroom doors, a central office area, and a multi-purpose room that had served as both cafeteria and gymnasium. The building had been empty for 15 years, but it was surprisingly well maintained. No broken windows, no graffiti, no signs of vandalism or squatters. Agent Patricia Wolf met me at the main entrance. She was the lead investigator on the case, a 20-year Bureau veteran with a reputation for solving impossible cases. Tom, we've got something unusual here, she said, leading me through the front doors. The building's been empty for over a decade, but someone's been maintaining it. Fresh batteries in the emergency lighting, clean floors, even the heat's been kept on to prevent pipe damage. As we walked through the main corridor, I noticed something that immediately struck me as odd. The hallway walls were lined with security cameras, modern, high-definition units that looked completely out of place in an abandoned building. The cameras were active, their red recording lights blinking steadily, tracking our movement as we passed. Agent Wolf, who installed these security systems? She shook her head. That's what we're trying to figure out. The city says they've never authorized surveillance equipment here. The school district claims no knowledge of it. But these cameras have been recording continuously, according to the timestamps we've found. The shooting had occurred in classroom 7B, about halfway down the main corridor. The room looked exactly like it had when the school closed. Student desks, arranged in neat rows, a teacher's desk at the front, educational posters still hanging on the walls. But there were bullet holes in the back wall that didn't match the trajectory from where the ATF agents had been standing. I began my standard documentation process, photographing the crime scene from multiple angles, measuring distances, cataloging evidence. But as I worked, I became aware of something disturbing. The classroom felt familiar, not just generically familiar in the way all school classrooms look alike, but specifically familiar, as if I had been in this exact room before. I pushed the feeling aside and continued working. But when I moved to the teacher's desk to photograph potential evidence, I found something that stopped me cold. Sitting in the center of the desk was a manila folder labeled Visitor Logs, December 2004, December 2024. Inside the folder were hundreds of handwritten entries documenting every person who had entered the building over the past 20 years. Names, dates, times of entry and exit, and detailed notes about what each visitor had done while inside. The handwriting was meticulous, old-fashioned, as if someone from another era had been keeping these records. I flipped through the pages, looking for recent entries that might help identify the shooter. But what I found made my hands shake as I read. My own name appeared dozens of times throughout the 20-year record, dating back to when I was still in college. Tom Reeves, age 19, photography student, entered at 4:15 p.m., photographed classroom 3 amperes, left at 6:22 p.m., March 8, 2001. Tom Reeves, age 23, freelance photographer, entered at 11:30 a.m., documented main office, left at 2:45 p.m., July 16, 2005. Entry after entry, year after year, documenting visits I had no memory of making to a school in a city I had never been to before today. Agent Wolf noticed me staring at the logbook. Find something useful? I showed her the entries with my name. She examined them carefully, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Tom, when did you first start working for the Bureau? 2008. I've been doing federal crime scene photography for 16 years. According to this log, you've been visiting this building since 2001. That's 23 years of documented visits to a school that's been abandoned for 15 years. We found the source of the surveillance footage in the old principal's office. A sophisticated recording system had been installed behind a false wall, with dozens of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. The equipment looked expensive and professional, but there were no manufacturer's labels or serial numbers that could help us trace its origin. The footage went back 20 years, stored on server arrays that hummed quietly in climate-controlled cabinets. Agent Wolf began reviewing the most recent recordings while I continued documenting the crime scene, but I found myself drawn back to the visitor logs. The entries about my visits were incredibly detailed, not just when I had arrived and left, but what I had photographed, which rooms I had spent time in, even conversations I had supposedly had with someone identified only as the caretaker. According to the logs, I had been documenting changes in the building's temporal stability and evidence of chronological displacement events. I had no idea what those phrases meant, but they appeared in connection with my name in dozens of entries spanning 2 decades. That's when Agent Wolf called me back to the principal's office. She had found something on the surveillance footage that drained the color from her face. Tom, you need to see this. The recording from this morning, just before the shooting. On the monitor, I watched myself entering the building at 9:15 a.m., 3 hours before the official crime scene team had arrived. I was carrying my camera equipment and walking with obvious familiarity through corridors I was certain I had never seen before. The timestamp was clear, the image was sharp, and it was definitely me. But I had no memory of entering the building that morning. According to my own records, I had received the assignment at noon and had driven directly from Detroit to Flint, arriving at the crime scene around 2 p.m. There's more, Agent Wolf said, fast-forwarding through the footage. Look at this. The recording showed me in classroom 7B at 9:45 a.m., photographing the exact same bullet holes I was currently documenting. But the ATF training exercise hadn't started until 10 a.m., and the shooting that created those bullet holes didn't occur until 11:15. I was documenting evidence of a crime that hadn't happened yet when I photographed it. Agent Wolf continued reviewing the footage while I tried to make sense of what we were seeing. The recording showed me visiting the building regularly over the past 20 years, always alone, always carrying camera equipment, always documenting things that seemed to be related to crime scenes that hadn't occurred yet. In footage from 2012, I was photographing chalk outlines in classroom 4C. In 2018, I was documenting blood spatter patterns in the cafeteria. In 2021, I was measuring bullet trajectories in the main office. None of these crimes had ever been reported. There were no police records, no federal investigations, no victims. But the evidence was there in the building, captured in my photographs, documented in the visitor logs that someone had been keeping for 20 years. That's when I found the photographs. Hidden in a filing cabinet in the teacher's lounge were hundreds of crime scene photos, all taken with the same professional equipment I used, all bearing my digital signature and timestamp data. Photos of crimes that had never been reported, evidence of incidents that had never officially occurred. But the most disturbing discovery was a letter addressed to me, dated December 5th, 2024, today's date. The letter was in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. Tom, the letter read, by the time you read this, you'll have completed another cycle. You've been documenting these crimes for 23 years, but you only remember starting 16 years ago. The building exists outside normal time, and you've been caught in its loop since you were 19 years old. Every visit erases your memory of the previous ones, but the evidence remains. Check camera 12. You'll see yourself leaving through the back exit at 6:47 p.m. today. But Tom, today's recording shows you never actually leave. You've been here for 23 years, documenting the same crimes over and over, creating evidence of things that happen and unhappen in endless cycles. The caretaker will explain everything, just like he explained it to you yesterday, and last year, and every year since 2001. Welcome back to the Martin Luther King Elementary School. Your work here is almost complete. I ran to camera 12's monitor. The timestamp showed 6:47 p.m., exactly the time mentioned in the letter. On the screen, I watched myself walk toward the back exit of the building, my investigation apparently complete. But as I reached the door, something impossible happened. Instead of leaving, the figure on the screen, me, simply faded away, like a photograph dissolving. And then, a moment later, the recording showed me entering through the front door again, carrying the same equipment, looking around with the same confused expression I remembered having when I first arrived. The loop was starting over. Agent Wolf was calling my name, but her voice sounded distant, like it was coming through water. I looked at my watch. 6:47 p.m. Time to leave. Time to complete another cycle. But this time, I knew. I left the letter where I had found it, along with all the evidence I had photographed. Someone else would investigate this case tomorrow, would find the same impossible recordings, the same visitor logs, the same documentation of crimes that existed outside of normal time. My official report listed the shooting as an unknown subject incident with ongoing investigation. The surveillance equipment was noted as origin undetermined, and the visitor logs were classified as possible hoax materials. But I kept copies of everything, hidden in a safety deposit box that I visit every December 5th. Because I learned something in that abandoned school that no federal training ever taught me. Some crimes happen in loops, creating evidence that exists before the events occur, documented by investigators who forget they've been investigating the same case for decades. And sometimes, when I'm reviewing crime scene photographs for other cases, I find images I don't remember taking, scenes I've never investigated, evidence I've never collected, all bearing my digital signature and professional documentation standards. The school keeps records, and those records show that my work there isn't finished. There are more crimes to document, more evidence to collect, more loops to complete. I just don't remember how many times I've already been back.